a song of love and hate, of love unto the lowly and hatred to the great. The great who trod our fathers down, who steal our children's bread, who stand our free spirit to rob the living and the dead. They sing a rebel song as we proudly sweep along.
100,000 men are going to march on Downing Street, which they intend to take by storm. There are thousands of mounted police and tens of thousands of foot police ready to deal with the insurgents. Machine guns have been mounted on certain buildings in readiness to sweep the streets.
Why all this unrest? What ails the workers? It seems that in the rebound from the anxieties of the war, we're all trying to get something for nothing. Too much selfishness exists. We must not ask for the impossible.
Our march is near at dawn, with the setting of the sun, and the tyrant's might is passing with the passing of the years.
Ramsay MacDonald, first Labour Prime Minister, elected 1924.
We shall concentrate, not first of all on the relief of unemployment, but on the restoration of trade. We are not going to diminish industrial capital in order to provide relief. That is the old, sound socialist doctrine. Stanley Baldwin, Conservative Prime Minister, 1925.
All the workers of this country have got to take reductions in wages to help put industry on its feet. I am convinced that if the time should come when the community had to protect itself, with the full strength of the government behind it, the community will do so. I say it merely as a warning.
The general strike is a direct challenge to ordered government. There can be no question of a compromise of any kind. Either the country will break the general strike, or the general strike will break the country.
The failure of the general strike shows what a sane people the British are. If only our revolutionaries would realise the hopelessness of their attempt to turn the British workman into a Red Russian.
Yes, not Red Russians yet, not quite yet. Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us to Redline TV. This is the Have Your Say program, where we are discussing issues that arose through the last week's program. And we had a bit of a discussion on the role of the general strike. Should the left call for a general strike now? What kind of general strike? 1 day, 2 day, unlimited, etc. And what would that look like? And so we showed a little clip from the 1926 general strike, and that quote, which was from the British Gazette, which was run by the British government at the time, is quite telling, I think. The general strike is a direct challenge to ordered government. Either the country will break the general strike, or the general strike will break the country. I thought that was quite a good quote. Here to discuss some of these issues with us is Graham Bash. Hello, previous editor of Labour Briefing magazine. So what lessons do you take from the 1926 general strike? And I should say we actually are looking into doing a proper show on the 1926 general strike, because it is so rich, such a rich part of our history, with lots of things going on, war with Russia, the revolution in Russia, etc., that it deserves its own program. So here we want to just talk about some of the lessons we can take from that. Hi, Graham.
Well, I think the lessons were spelt out by the person who spoke. Either the country will break the general strike, or the general strike will break the country. Last week, we were discussing the cost of living crisis, and there were calls for a general strike from speakers and on chat. Now, I want to make myself clear. I'm really sympathetic. I understand why people are desperately looking for solutions. So what is their attitude? We're in the middle of a growing strike wave. Rail workers, postal workers, it's enormous. And we're all going on picket lines. It's the biggest strike wave in decades, more to come. So what's behind it? Well, first and above all, of course, as we said last week, the cost of living crisis itself, post-Brexit, post-COVID, post-Ukraine war. Roaring inflation leading to defensive strikes, reactive strikes, in a desperate struggle to survive. I think there's a secondary issue as well, which is a despair with political solutions. So often our movement, when it despairs either of one or the other. Political and industrial solutions will look to the other. And with the end of Corbyn's Labour Party and the vacuum of a party under Starmer, of course, there's no immediate political solutions to this crisis that we discussed last week. But the point is, we're only just beginning to recover after decades of weakness and defeat after the miners' strike, with little more now than half the numbers in trade unions that we had 40 years ago. So obviously, the most immediate need is to coordinate these strike actions. But let's just deal with this question of a general strike. And yes, I think we should discuss it in much more detail at another time. But I think we need words of caution. General strikes, to the extent that they're successful, paralyze the functions of the state and inevitably spill over into a challenge to the existing order of society, as the person said. And they pose the question of power. So to all our comrades who call for general strikes, my question is this: how are we preparing as a movement for that? Because general strikes are not a panacea, a solution in themselves, nor are they a replacement for political solutions. Now, this is not an argument, let me make it clear, in the slightest against generalized action. On the contrary, but this needs preparation and politicization. And it raises point blank the issue we just touched on last week, which is the issue and the need for political trade unionism.
Let me just stop you there before we go into that issue, because I think you make a really important point there on the need to be prepared. Unless it's a one-day general strike, you can have a one-day general strike, which is in effect a demonstration, isn't it? That's all it is. It's not actually a general strike if you're just having one day, and the ruling class knows you're going to go back afterwards. If we're talking about an unlimited general strike that has a certain set of demands that we're not backing down until these demands are met, that is posing the question of political power, as you said. In 1926. The TUC actually supported the call for a general strike when the miners were attacked in their working conditions and their wages were attacked. They supported that. But what then happened is the government backed down, it's what called Red Friday, and said, oh, okay, well, we subsidized the wages of the miners for a while now, 9 months as it turned out. And in those 9 months, the government planned for civil war. The government planned. The police were put out around, the army was called in, there were arrangements made, 100,000 people were drafted in to break the strike. So the other side prepared for the general strike. It's just the TUC and our side which didn't prepare, which to a large degree led to the general strike being defeated. So I just wanted to make that point. I think it's incredibly important to prepare our side, and we didn't do that in the 1926 general strike, I would argue.
Absolutely, it's a question. If we're talking about general strikes, we're playing with dynamite. Now, I'm not against playing with dynamite as long as we know how to use it. And if we go into a general strike like the movement did in 1926, it put us back for a generation and more. And I mean, the last time, it was actually in my lifetime, there was generalized action anywhere near a general strike, was that very short period over the Pentonville Five, when the movement was strong enough to force the government to retreat on the jailing of the Pentonville Five. Had that developed, who knows what would happen? But I mean, look, I'm from that old tradition. I was around in the 1970s. I was brought out this magazine called The Chartist, not the kind of pale pink thing that you have today, but when it was a kind of revolutionary paper, but in the Labour Party. And our slogan was always prepare for the general strike. If we're not prepared to deal with the issue of power, then we're not prepared for a general strike. Be careful and be bold at the same time. But this does, as I was saying, raise the issue which we touched on last week of political unionism. And Mick Lynch made such a good speech, I thought. I wasn't there, but I saw the clip of it at Tolpuddle when he said trade unions He said trade unions, not the Labour Party, trade unions must plant the banner of trade unions in our communities and on that basis force political solutions from the Labour Party if we may, without it outside if we must. And I thought that was incredibly strong. But what does it mean, political trade unionism? And I just want to get this point. It is of course fighting for a political expression, whether it's the Labour Party or what, for our trade union demands, but it's also for trade unions themselves to go beyond fighting for just economic high wages, better conditions, because it raises the question, this cost of living crisis, who fights for the unemployed, for those on benefits, for those on pensions? And these issues cannot just be resolved by strikes alone, but by political programme. And the problem is that with the vacuum in the absence of a Labour Party currently playing any role, then the role of trade unions in this political struggle, as well as industrial struggle, becomes absolutely central. So I think that, if you like, was the discussion that we had last week. And I just wanted to kind of codify some of those points, because I think that unless we can talk about political trade unionism, then we are really not having, in my opinion, the right discussion.
There's also the question, of course, of politicizing, not just politicizing the trade union movement, but also democratizing it, which I think is perhaps has to do with the lack of political action taken by a lot of trade unions. It's very bureaucratic, top down. The members don't really have much say, do they?
Well, the only way we can overcome that is obviously a conscious fight for democratization, but it's building a movement from below. Building a movement that cannot be reined in, kept down. And the only way we're going to democratise our whole movement, the trade unions and the Labour Party, is through the struggle from below. We're beginning to see early seeds of this. I don't think it's great and we're all involved in it, but I think we've got to see how it goes, try and generalise it, but we also need to understand where we're at. We're not where we were 40, 50 years ago in terms of the industrial strength of the movement. There's huge advances have been made as well, though. And as it's been pointed out in various Zoom meetings I've been to, how the trade union movement now contains a majority of women. And that obviously is changing for the better, the whole of the movement. But, you know, we're at an early stage of recovery. And I think it's important to know the road we've got to travel, but also not assume that we're further along that road than we actually are.
What do you think about movements like the unemployed workers movement, which in the 1920s organized huge marches and played a huge role in politicizing and organizing the unemployed?
There's huge lessons for us. And I think if we're going to have lessons, discussions on labour history, such as the general strike, we also need to include at some point these movements outside of those actually working. And it isn't just the unemployed, it's all of those on benefits, all of those on pensions. And unless we can speak for the class as a whole, then there's a problem, because that's what the trade unions and ultimately the Labour Party or whatever, if it comes to it, takes its place, has to do.
Students as well, housewives, you know, there's lots of people who don't have a wage of such.
Well, we are many, they are few, but we've got to these wonderful words. We've got to demonstrate that in practice.
So you're basically saying the general strike is not well, you know, it would be good if we could organize a real general strike. It's not a shortcut. I think lots of people see it as a sort of solution to the problems we have today.
We're nowhere near there yet, and if we are, let's not treat it as a panacea, because then the question is, great, we've got a general strike, then what? Then what is the political outcome of that general strike? It doesn't solve anything in itself. It poses questions for us to answer, but it's not an answer in itself.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Graham. Comrades, we're going to take one more short discussion and then we're opening up for contributions on this subject, and then we're moving on to the Corbyn party. But we want to deal with the trade union question first. Graham, stay with us. I'm going to bring in Mike Cowley, who's introducing our next guest. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Tina. Hi, comrades. Good to see everyone. If you live in the Edinburgh area, even if you live in Scotland, you may well have come across our next guest, Willie Black, in your travels. Willie is what we call a well-kent face up here. I've put in two, comrades, in the chat box, a couple of links that will introduce you to Willie and his work. The first one, which kind of made Willie's name, at least for 15 minutes, is from, is that a confrontation, or would that be too strong, Willie? Ian Duncan Smith was speaking at an invitation-only meeting, which resourcefully Willie managed to inveigle his way into and regale Mr. Smith with some fine Scottish invective about his record at the time. The second one is a lovely, lovely film, which I would recommend, again on YouTube, which describes some of the community work Willie and many, many others have been involved in Pilton. One of those areas in Edinburgh which is, I guess, pejoratively described as a deprived area. So, Willie, what we wanted to talk to you about particularly tonight was an initiative, the latest initiative, I guess, that you're involved in, which I guess is consistent with Mick Lynch's appeal to the trade union movement to plant a flag in working class communities, irrespective of whether people are working or not, as Tina says. Could you tell us a wee bit about that? I think it's called Trade Unions in the Community. Is that right, Willie?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah, what we're trying to do is put that flag that Graham talked about squarely in the communities, to take the trade unions from the narrowness of, and it's a good fight to fight for terms and conditions. As Engels said, it's the schools of war, and you learn a great deal just fighting over the toilet paper and your wages. But in terms of class, we need to bring that unity that's required. And if there was a general strike, nobody would be working and everybody would be in their community or the picket line or the marches or the demonstrations. So what we found in COVID was that we needed to feed hundreds of thousands of people. And right across Edinburgh, that was done, in particularly where I am in North Edinburgh. We were able to feed, I think the latest figure was about 400,000 food packs to shielded people and whatever. We set up warehouses, we used all the community centres, we did some tremendous work. But in itself, it was just papering over some of the problems. So some of us, some activists, particularly in the unions, I'm in community, Unite Community, we were able to put an argument forward about a year ago that really, if there was going to be a cost of living and poverty, before the cost of living situation that arose just recently, there was clearly deep problems in communities with poverty and food and housing and all the rest. So what we decided to do was to see if it was possible to win the trade union movement, particularly in the Edinburgh area where there's a strong trade union history, trade union Congress, TUC, the Trades Council, and try and bring together a number of major union branches to think about opening trade union offices, but not just trade union offices, where it badged as trade unions, but actually a place of struggle or resistance. And from that, we'd be able to maybe, and it's a maybe, move the situation where we've got six and a bit million to maybe what Graham was alluding to in the 70s and early 80s, where 13 million. There is many people in the trade union that are not members of the trade union, many great trade union, community activists that aren't members of the unions. The question then is, can they join a general union that invites people from communities to join? But also, if they come to the trade union office with all the issues that people face, is there a trade union? Can we give a flagpole or an indication of where they could join the union? So if they come and they work for ASDA, then then we would signpost them. That was the word I was trying to struggle with. Signpost them to the appropriate union. So it isn't about this union or that union. It is a general thing about building trade unions through the communities, but also helping and supporting and creating bases of resistance in the communities and shorten that gap between political and economic.
Thanks, Willie. And it's the second element of that ambition that I guess the show tonight is concerned with, because you're not, from what I understand, simply trying to establish a recruitment centre in Hilton or anywhere else so that we can increase trade union membership and so on. You're actually, it sounds like trying to fill a political vacuum that the Mick Lynch, as Graham and others have said, have actually invited the trade union movement to do, to step into a vacuum that the Labour Party has for some time now, we know, vacated. So how do you see, if you do see this initiative stepping into a political role and not just a trade union role?
I think also that the people who will, the volunteers, the people who will person up these bases will be a mixture or trade union activists, people on facility time, retired members of the union, full-time, even full-time officials that have done a job in the movement, and that we think is a really, really important aspect. But if it was only and purely simply for trade union recruitment, and I know that in some people that's how they see it, but that is not how the majority see it. What the majority sees is that for a long time, if we fight for wages and conditions within the 6 million, it'll be a tremendous step forward, and it'll be an inspiration, as we've seen for the picket lines on the telly, as we've seen for Mike Lynch and other union officials appearing on the telly. The boom in trade union membership is there. The question is, who fights for our class? The question then is, are we fighting in a class for itself? And that means class, but that means consciousness. There was once, I remember a joke about the trade union official. He's at the mass meeting, and the mass meeting, he shouts, "Yeah, we've got a fiver. What do you think?" And everybody shouts, "No." Then he said, "Well, I'll have to go back." So he went back to the management, asked for more, came back, and he said, "We're fighting. I've got you a tenner." And everybody, "What do you think?" And everybody shouts, "No." And he says in frustration, "What the hell do you want?" And a wee voice with the back says, "Socialism." And he says, "The management will never agree to that." And that certainly sense of the limitations of trade unions that are only purely and simply fighting on economics. We need that. We need workers to fight back, and that creates the possibilities of recognising their power, because passivity in the trade union movement has created the situation we're facing at the present moment. So I'm not sure if there's a void that the Labour Party has vacated, but I think there is a need to link communities and trade unions together, and to look and fight and create a resistance on the cost of living and other issues.
You mentioned COVID a wee moment ago, Willie, and probably everyone in this room throughout those 2 years, whether in the workplace as a trade union rep or just a community activist, has done some kind of work filling the gap where the state should have been. And we're looking at the development not long afterwards. In fact, as we know, the COVID crisis is very far from gone away. Edinburgh, for example, is experiencing a real spike at the moment. Yeah. But do you think these things are linked? Because what we saw through COVID, it shouldn't have had to happen, but in many ways the community stepped in and began to experience a sense of power in what it could achieve, autonomy, agency, in place of where the state ought to have been. Do you think that has had any impact on this sense of empowerment and momentum that the trade union movement seems to be experiencing right now? Is there a sense that, well, we can do more than simply win a dispute? We can actually begin to talk, as Mick Lynch and Shan Graham are doing and others are doing, about why we are in disputes, what the economic structures, the material circumstances of capital actually are, and why we're always having to fight for wages and improved terms conditions year after year.
I think there is always a different level. When people do exactly what you describe, they're not passive, they're not, they're in activity, and activity leads to debate and discussion and tactics and the whole rest of that. So what you learn, or what we learned from the COVID, when we were in the deeper position in it, we realized that we couldn't do it singly as particular organizations. So 38 organizations in North Edinburgh, in my experience, came together and we created that. Did it raise it to the level of class politics? No, we had a shouting match with the funders, the government, Westminster, Scottish Government and whatever, and we got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of support. But we had to fight for that, and we recognised that we had to fight for that. So that, in a sense, I'm not seeing communities don't always, even when they've got tenants organisations and the rest, have a high level of class consciousness. They're aware of their circumstances, poor, hungry, no fuel, all that kind of stuff. But the question of class is different. When you fight for others, you're more likely, and that's where the trade unions can bring in. So what we're now seeing on lots of picket lines, organisations which, and Graham might recognise this, I went to a trade union picket line with the BT workers in the 70s, and they told me to leave along with others. And we said, well, why would we leave? We're here in solidarity. Well, they said, if you're not leaving, we are. And the whole picket line went away. I can't see that situation happening now in George Square, in the Central Station in Glasgow. The kind of picket lines that were being created with live and rent, with different organisations coming to in solidarity, other trade unions, and we saw that with the nurses on Saturday in George Square, when the RMT turned up to support the NHS nurses that were demonstrating. So we're beginning to see that solidarity happening. And I think that's really to be encouraged. And anybody who says, no, you can't come to our picket line, or any trade union official or leader or whatever says that, I think inside that union, you should be fighting really hard to stop that. Because when you talk about a general strike, you talk about crossing unions. You know, a teacher isn't in the NUM, but how would they fight for the whole of our class? They only can do that when they accept we're fighting for the whole of our class.
Thanks, Billy. A really positive insight to finish with. The picket lines I've seen up here as well. The UCW one a couple of weeks ago, just outside Waverley Station, were full of people who are not directly employed within that sector, and they were welcomed. It's understood now that there's a broadening of the struggle and that everyone is welcome on picket lines. So hang on, Willie. I'm sure you can contribute to the discussion as we go along, and I'll hand back to Tina. Thanks, Willie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Willie. That was very interesting. We've got a person in the audience, Dan Williams, who would like to come in, who's from Acorn, which is kind of similarly to what you just described, has taken over particular functions. Hi, Dan. Do you want to describe what you do? Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm from Acorn. We're a community union, very similar to what you were just describing. What we try and do is represent all members of the community, whether that's working people, unemployed people, basically anyone who's on a lower income or is struggling to get by. And so I'm based in Brighton. I'm the campaign coordinator in Brighton. And we've recently been running a campaign for trying to end housing benefit discrimination. So people on benefits haven't been able to access housing in Brighton. It's a nationwide problem, but particularly prominent in Brighton. So we've been running that for the last couple of months. And I think what I would say is that, yeah, the trade unions are obviously absolutely the core of the movement. They have to be and have to stay that way. But what we find is that we can kind of reach out into different elements of the community that wouldn't necessarily feel that they had a connection to the trade unions. And that's really helpful for us. So we can speak to people who wouldn't feel that that they necessarily, even if they could join a trade union, they wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable doing so. So yeah, that's what we're doing at the moment.
Great, good work. Okay, Malcolm has got a question. If you could come in, please.
Yeah, I'd like to ask. Oh, where am I? I'd like to ask Graham the question actually, because I mean I became a Republican when I was 12, which was before most of you were born, I'm sure. And what has puzzled me, you say so, 1952. Anyway, what I never understood is how a society can make structural changes without it ending up with something like Stalin or something like that, because the Labour Party has got written its rule book. They are a democratic socialist party. Well, but that's a laugh, isn't it? I mean, I'm not in the Labour Party. I expelled them. They didn't expel me. But I mean, how do you make structural change? And I think I'm not very an expert on Marx, but he described something called the bourgeois republic. And the bourgeois he described was a rich elite. Now, I don't know of a country in the world, apart from things like North Korea and others places, where a rich elite doesn't run the country, even in places like Finland and all those places where it's all wonderful. And so how do you get the very rich people to say, look, you know what? I'm tired of being rich and owning everything and having these huge estates, and I would like to just give them to everybody. And I'd just like to sit in a little house and have an ordinary income and be ordinary like everybody else. I mean, how do you see that happening? I mean, that's it.
Yes, Graham, how?
Question of questions, Malcolm, but I'm sure I'm probably older than you, but let's leave that aside.
Well, let's not have an
question of questions. Well, you certainly don't get the rich and the powerful to say, I think I'd like to give up my power. You take it.
Yeah.
You've got to have the power, the strength, the organization to take it. Now, of course, if we look back in history, it don't look good sometimes. I mean, you're quite right. Within 10 years or less, but 10 years of the Russian Revolution, which was one of the most magnificent events in world history, the bureaucracy, the elite had taken control. But there were specific material reasons for that. It's not an iron law, it's not natural, because the leaders of the Russian Revolution, we are really getting away from the subject we started from, but since you asked.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but you started with the general strike.
I did.
And the general strike was sort of maybe going to turn into something like that.
Not a criticism, Malcolm. I'm smiling to myself. I can never talk about the Russian Revolution too much. It's but the leaders of the Russian Revolution, Lenin and Trotsky, were very clear that this could lead to a real fundamental change only if it was part of an international revolution. And this was limited only to the Soviet Union, to Russia. And it turned in on itself because it didn't have the material base to go beyond that. Had there been a revolution in, say, Germany, for instance, which was quite possible, November 1918 up to various possibilities up to 1923, then I think that it may well have been different. But I'm worried about the kind of implication that the powerful will always be powerful, the elite will always be the elite, and that's somehow a lesson from history. Because we, in the early days of humanity, there was a real collectivism in early societies.
Of course. Yes,
so it's not human nature.
No,
but let's not wait for the rich and powerful to decide they've had enough. That will never happen. We have to organize, build up the forces of resistance to take the power from them and give them no alternative. And our choice to them is, well, we're building a new egalitarian society. If you want to be part of it, you're welcome. If you don't, well, you'll have to face some consequences.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Graham, for answering that one. I'm going to bring us quickly back to the main subject. Mind you, the revolution is always the main subject. This is the question how we get there. But, you know, talking about the general strike, just to show you the result of our survey, should we campaign for a general strike? 70% say yes. Not sure, 15%. No, 7%. Do you feel sufficiently educated about the general strike of 1926? That's definitely, I think, a sign that tells us we should organize a proper session on it, because it was hugely important. It was you could say, pre-revolutionary situation in Britain, as in many other countries at the time. So that's very interesting. Do you think it's good that the unions are affiliated to Labour, or should we campaign for disaffiliation? Not quite as clear-cut as I thought it would be. So 50% think they should disaffiliate, but almost 30% think they should stay affiliated to the Labour Party. So that's interesting. And this is one of Graham's favourite subjects. Do you think the left should campaign for a more democratic electoral system? That brings us to another subject. Actually, we're going to talk about that in a little later. But back to the union question. So we've got the next person with a hand up is Jane. You've got a question or a comment. Hi.
Hello, I'm Jane. A couple of things there. Graham, I'm still grieving the loss of Rosa. You know, had it succeeded, Lenin wouldn't have had to do the 5-year plan. Okay, I know we're on trade unions and community activism. Hello, Willie Black. You must be so proud of your girls. What Tora and Sarah and Zoe are doing in community activism, they got your blood. I worked in your house many years ago. We met briefly. I worked with Heather years ago with the druggies. Okay, community activism and trade unions. I think it's really important. There's something that came up to me. Yeah, what was it? Oh, yeah. Don'tpay.uk. Now, they're kind of connecting that with the poll tax. But, you know, there was a lot of legwork. We talked about how do we generate community activism and connect that to an economic framework that understands why does the Me Too, the trans, the this, that, and the other, what do they all have in common? If you sit them all down, what do they all have in common? Why are they connected? And I think we need to get that kind of political education out there. So yeah, the Don't Pay UK on the poll tax. But you know, there was a lot of legwork. I had notes because I get senior moments. Starting with the trots in Scotland, there was a lot of legwork going into that. And there would be a lot of legwork going into recognizing how we connect community activism to the trade union movement. And I love what you said, Willie, about, I don't know, how do we do that? I'm working class, I got through a polytechnic, but I'll tell you what, by the time of the second year, we were through volume 3 at Capital, Edinburgh University on community work courses. They're lucky if they get a neb into the Communist Manifesto. They're all on Foucault and sex. I mean, you know, so, you know, don't think the students coming up are going to do it. How do we get back to the communities, which I feel it's important that they understand? And let me just give you a quick example. I got a pal from Armadale, druggie, cleaned up. She goes to Edinburgh University, and she's now working with the druggies, cutting out things out of the newspaper. And her dissertation was, you know, community work today in the framework of neoliberal, blah, 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 blah. And she's bringing into the community a connection of understanding where we are to raise consciousness. I mean, nobody's reading Lukács and Gramsci anymore. Come on. So I don't know how to do it. So I just want to put that out there that, you know, I think that's an important element, because the Labour Party and Sunak and Truss, they're Thatcherites. And Maggie with a Hayekian Bible under her arm, I mean, since then, the facts of where we are appalling, you know. And Mike Lynch today was beautiful, you know. Progressive taxation is positive and good, not lower taxes, because it pays for public services. And we need to kind of get that out there. And he's just been brilliant. I just think he's great. Anyway, that's me. On you go.
Thank you, Jane. I'm going to bring a few more people in, and then we can see if anybody would like to reply to a few things. Matthew, please.
Hey, comrades. No, very interesting, the results of the survey. I don't agree with Graham. The Russian Revolution is clearly the most important event in human history because, as pointed out at the time, it does point the way to the future, and nobody's gone past it so far. Therefore, we're still working to that mark. Anyway, beside the point. The other thing is that in terms of what we're facing at the moment, what's happening now, of course, is sort of obverse of what we had with Corbyn. With Corbyn, we had a political movement which unfortunately was very confused, but there was a political debate. However, of course, there was no particular class struggle. The level of the class struggle was very low. Now, of course, we get the reverse. We have the class struggle coming back as the capitalist class, the government, of course, attempt to squeeze working class living standards under conditions in which obviously the working class is up against it, not just here, but everywhere. And at the same time, of course, unfortunately for them, of course, they've managed to crush the Corbyn and so on, and disorganise the left. Now, the core here is what you've got is a whole series of workers moving into action, to defend their wages. And their conditions and their jobs, which is good. But the thing is that it's general. It is general. It's across the entire class virtually, and therefore, in those terms, we should be arguing. The problem we've got also is the fact that, of course, it's controlled by the union bureaucracy. We should actually look at the union bureaucracy as being something that's not under our control. It's not accountable. It's not democratically controlled, and it does have its own interests. And it is closer actually to management and the capitalists than it is the workers. No question. We're sitting in a situation in which the unions are calling one-day strikes. Each one in isolation. And then making sure that none of those strikes are on the same day. Now, there's not an accident in that. We have other sections of workers who have been, virtually the entire public sector will now be offered something on the order of 5%, which is another wage cut, under conditions in which the Tories, of course, will then turn around and say, well, we're not going to fund that, which is another big cut, actually, to public services. So you get a attack on jobs and your wages at once. So the point being is, how do we generalize the struggle? Now, the thing is, obviously, what we want really is to say, right, we need to take that out. We need to have organisation. We need to organise this across locally in terms of building committees of action across in each town and saying, okay, we're having a series of workers coming out, but the question is that those workers have to organise themselves. The core of the most important thing about what happened in the 70s and 60s and 70s was the fact that the shop stewards movement and so on took the control of much of the struggle out of the hands of the bureaucracy. They did it themselves, and the bureaucracy, the war was at least as much with the union bureaucracy as it was with the management. And the union bureaucracy was desperate to get back control and beat down that organisation. And the question is, how do we rebuild it? The second point is we should at least say we want at least a one-day general strike, because it's obviously for the situation, because the whole of the class, unlike under Thatcher, where she took on one section at a time, they're taking on the whole class. Therefore, we want a response by the entire class. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Do you want to reply, Graham?
No, no, I'll come in later. Okay. I don't want to keep coming in every time.
No, fair enough. Steve Freeman.
I'm muted. Hi, Willie. How are you doing? All right. I haven't seen you for a while. I think we ought to think about different kinds of general strikes. I think that would be a useful idea. So, for example, we could have a spontaneous general strike, or we could have a planned general strike. Sometimes you get them by a movement just coming out of the blue, and sometimes they're planned. Then, of course, you can have economic general strikes, like 1926, where the objectives are economic ones. You can have political general strikes, like the one that was mentioned before to free the dockers in 1972, where there's a clear political objective And that objective was achieved when the dockers were set free by that. The government turned up and thought, we better get them out of jail quick, otherwise there's more trouble brewing. And then you can have a constitutional general strike. I mean, if you had a general strike in Scotland for Scottish independence and self-determination, that would be a constitutional general strike. So it is trying to change the constitution of the country. And in February 1917, of course, you had more or less a general strike, which did overthrow the Tsarist constitution and established a republic. And that wasn't the end of the struggle, it was merely the beginning of it. But the reason they could have a political general strike a constitutional general strike in Russia is because the Bolsheviks have been agitating for 20 or 30 years to overthrow Tsarism. And so it was easy for people to rally in the conditions of war to change the political system and change the constitution of the country. Now, if you go back to 1926, it's worth noting that in 1926, the miners went for an economic general strike. But the government said, this isn't just an economic general strike. Oh, no, it's a constitutional action. These miners are trying to overthrow the country. They're trying to change our way of life. And we must rally to defend the state and the constitution. And the workers said, no, we're not. We only want some bit more money. If you give us a bit more money, we'll be fine. So the working class didn't go in a political and constitutional direction. There was no attempt to overthrow the state, the constitution in 1926. The objectives were limited, but the Tories, the government, was very political, very constitutional, and that's why they won and the miners actually lost. So I think if we're talking about the present situation, there is an spontaneous economic general strike going, in the sense that different sections of workers are coming together almost in line to bring about an economic general strike. But there's no idea that there is any political objective, any of this, overthrow the government. And it's certainly no constitutional objectives, unless, Tina, they're striking for proportional representation. I don't know if they're doing that, but that would be one that you'd probably like as well. I don't think Graham's going to like that. I can see he's shaking his head, but a constitutional general strike to overthrow the system of voting, well, that would be something quite, and of course it wouldn't be narrow then, it would draw in whole sections of people. I'm not advocating that, but just to say as a constitution. So I think we'd do better if we started talking about the kind of strikes we're talking about, economic, political, constitutional, then we know what the objectives are, and then we know where we're going. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Steve. If there's nobody else who wants to speak on that, I'd invite Graham and Willie to come back on a few of those questions, if you'd like to. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go first. If
go on
okay,
then,
Willie.
Go on, Graham.
Well, Steve, you can, if a general strike inevitably, usually is going to be on an economic general strike, but as you said, the government, the state, will make it a political one. And they're prepared politically, and our movement isn't. And that's why, unless there is a political dimension to any such strike movement at that level, it will lose. Unless, of course, it is for on a very specific issue, like it was going that way with the Pentonville 5. And the government was, in 1972, was not prepared for that. But look, I just want to correct a couple of things I said myself. I was talking about how we've got to generalize, and our trade union movement has got to have a program that goes beyond just the economic. And I talked about pensioners and claimants, etc. And a good comrade of mine on the chat from Ramsgate, very near me in Broadstairs, and said, and the disabled, and that's absolutely right. And one of the comrades spoke about the poll tax movement. Now that was a really good example where a broader social movement actually was so strong, it went beyond just the trade unions. It certainly went beyond the Labour Party, and it was sufficiently strong to be a major factor in bringing down Thatcher. I mean, that's how strong it was. So that's something that we need to talk about as well. So now the question's been, I'll just make a couple of points. People are getting bored with me, and I'm probably bored with raising the same old thing time after time. But I looked at the survey there about affiliation. Let me make it clear. In the absence of an alternative that we are in the process of building to the Labour Party, and it should be built, in the absence of that, I'm against disaffiliation, because just as I'm against individuals leaving the Labour Party, we've got to act collectively. That's the whole tradition of our movement. And if the trade unions are going to leave the Labour Party and in effect create another one, they can't do it one by one. It's got to be a collective action. If you like a general strike, you know, I mean, that's what it amounts to. It's got to be collective action. So I just think that the calls for disaffiliation are kind of another cry in the wilderness. Desperately understand. I mean, let's be clear, I've been expelled from the Labour Party after 53 years because I signed a petition that probably Tina was something to do with. I signed a petition from, Labour Against the Witch Hunt, which wasn't prescribed at the time. 18 months later, it became prescribed and I was out after 53 years. I could be bitter about it, but I'm not at all. I don't take this personally. It's a sign of the times, and there's a real danger that we are now without a political voice in our movement. Well, we are. It's not a danger, it's a fact. And we've been without a political voice for most of my political life, with the short exception of the Corbyn-McDonnell years. But I'm against disaffiliation unless we can see an alternative to affiliate to. And otherwise, you're going down the road of actually depoliticizing the very trade union movement we need to politicize. So, you know, that's all I've got to say on this. I'm sorry if I'm sounding like a stop clock, but I mean, I will keep saying it until events prove me wrong, which they may well do.
There's, of course, also something to be said about asking all organizations of the working class to actually join the Labour Party and exercise power that way, you know, without any prescriptions, etc. And we've had another person put their hand up, Paul.
I think Graham might, I can't remember, but he might have said it already, but I wanted to disagree slightly. I understand, I was interested in Steve's point about the different types of general strikes. I thought that was interesting because I hadn't really thought about that from that perspective, even though I'm a Republican and that sort of thing. But I have a slightly different interpretation of the 1926 general strike. It wasn't that the government, as far as I understand it, had much more power than the unions. In fact, in those days, much of industry was state-owned. We're not in that territory now. So that is a rather different scenario. But my understanding was that the government at the time, according to Niall Bevan, in his own book, In Place of Fear, was that the government basically threw the gauntlet to the union movement. The trouble was, the TUC, the leadership of the TUC basically realised that they weren't ready or prepared to take the lead of the state. If they were, that in itself could have led to a constitutional crisis, because it would have arguably, it might have been seen as undemocratic and so on. But yes, I just think that the understanding of the 1926 general strike is, as I say, my understanding was slightly different to what Steve said. Thanks.
Thank you, comrade. Willie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I thought somebody else was going to come in. You were going to bring in somebody called Norman, who I don't know. But
he's forgotten he's speaking in the second part of the meeting. Everybody's going
right,
on about
no,
Norman. He's speaking later, no worries.
Fine, that's fine. I have a visitor, so I'm not going to overstep my mark. Just to say that in the Russian Revolution, my understanding was bread, land, and peace seemed to fit very nicely. The circumstances of the war, the lack of food, and also the peasantry, and question of the land and the ownership of the land that they were ploughing up and whatever. So it is a question of what demands are made, and they have to be relevant to the to where we are now. And I think that's what we struggle for. The other thing is that I believe that the TUC have put a motion up calling for the Labour Party to nationalise the energy companies. This will be a slight clash, especially if you get people like Mike Lynch and others to stand up on the rostrum. They can't go to the Labour Party because they have been disaffiliated. But the question then is, what then? What if the policy of the TUC is different from Keir Starmer's Labour Party? Where does the clash come there? And what is the demands that we put on the movement, the Labour Party in particular? I've never been a member of the Labour Party. I've got no interest in joining the Labour Party. Got too many criticisms of it, but nevertheless, I've also got criticisms of trade union bureaucracy, because there was a dispute that would have changed things, and that was the P&O. And the people who were occupying the P&O liner were told by Mike Lynch and the executive of the RMT to leave the boat because they were threatened with the law, because the union was being threatened with the law. That's what the laws are about. They're not about disciplining the rank and file. They're about disciplining the bureaucracy so that they discipline the rank and file, because the threat then is for the whole of the union and its offices and wages and pensions and all the rest. That is the clash, because in the general strike, my understanding was that the leaders of the left, who were the Lenins and they were being couched in the terms, were actually they went and accepted the deal that was on the thingy, which is that Lloyd George called the bluff. And that joke about the management will never agree to it, because that's what the trade union bureaucracy are there for. They're there between the workers and the bosses to negotiate the terms and conditions. Therefore, we do need political unionism, because we have to break just through just the idea of fighting for fresh toilet paper or another pound on the rate or whatever. They are the conditions in which a general strike would be sufficient to break out. Somebody said that 15% of the workers on strike is general strike, 30% of the workers on strike is a revolution. So it always is about numbers. It's about size, and it's about cohesion, and it's about preparation and all the other things. The stuff that I'm talking about, the communities, could easily be something that the trade unions were capable of organising, food, etc., etc. There's a better example of what might have been a revolution in Britain, and that was 1919 in Glasgow, which was was inspired by 1917, the Russian Revolution, and they did put gunships into the Clyde, and they also put machine guns around the squares, so that there was a heightened position. But we always should take, if we're going back and looking at Glasgow, we should take inspiration from the Glasgow Shropshire's movement, the Clyde Shropshire's movement, who said we'll support the rank and file always, we'll support the bureaucracy sometimes when they properly represented us, but we will independently organise to fight for our own interests. So there is lots of elements in that really, I think, the trade unions and communities will actually take in, because many of the people who are involved in that struggle to create these bases and hubs and communities are aware of that. They're not just about bread and butter. They're about a class nature of the fight. And we need to get everybody's strength. So workers who are no worker at the moment, who are unemployed or they're disabled or otherwise, need to be fought with and for the trade union movement.
Yeah,
But
sorry, comrade, I'm going to have to.
Look
We
at
want to
that.
get
There
to
I've shut up.
another subject still. Sorry, Willie.
Yeah.
We could talk to you all night.
shut up.
No question. Mike,
Thank
a
you.
couple of sentences to sum up, but keep it brief, please, if you could.
Sure, I shall. I mean, I think the meeting's agreed. There's a consensus that you can't rush directly into a general strike or demand a general strike without a clear political understanding of where that general strike might be leading. And it's got to be prepared for. One of the things we've been saying, and we're all aware of this, economistic demands around terms, conditions, wages are narrow, they are limited, but they do one crucial thing, and that is provide material comfort and material gains for working people. It might not contribute to the political economy of the working class. It may not bring political step forwards, but what it also does is build trust. As a trade union rep at Edinburgh College for many years, been involved in many disputes. One of the things that my fellow reps are preoccupied with is building and sustaining trust amongst our members, so that when we do call on them during disputes, they are willing to come out because they trust us, they know that we're not making stuff up, and they're willing to hit the cobblestones. I think as socialists, although we may get frustrated from time to time about the limited demands of even the most militant campaigns, nonetheless, we have to be absolutely front and centre in saying we fundamentally support this, and we recognise the small incremental gains that can be built from this, not only materially in terms of the bread and butter issues, but politically. So I think that's one of the ways that we can build for a general strike if that's coming. It can't be imposed on people. You know, people have got to be organically ready and politically astute about why there is going to be a general strike and what the outcome of that strike is that they're hoping for. That's a lot of years of preparation and trust and building the kind of confidence in communities that going into communities, as Willie and others have been describing, does. People know your face, they know who you are, they know who the people that will be on the right side of the barricades are. And it's that kind of trust that builds confidence, so that when it comes to a more broadened kind of conflagration, then people will enter into that with an understanding that they are not doing it because someone else is imposing it or because it has ulterior motives. They're doing it because they're part of that struggle.
It's also the question, of course, that the ruling class will make preparations as well, and we should learn the lessons from the 26th strike, where the army was prepared, the strike breakers were prepared, and it will get bloody very quickly if it's a serious general strike. Thank you, Willie, very much, and Mike, thank you for joining for this discussion. We're now going to move on to the second part of what we discussed last week, which was the question that was raised by a couple of comrades in the discussion. Graham is not a happy bunny about it, but it is a very popular idea, which is the idea of Jeremy Corbyn leading a new left party, and that would kind of be a step forward, and we should campaign for it all, etc. I should say at this stage, reports this week in the newspapers indicate that there might be that he's, instead of standing as an independent, which could lead to the need to organize an organization, that he might stand as a London mayor, like Ken Livingstone done before, But before I talk to Norman now, I'm going to share this from our survey, which is the question of: do you think the left should campaign for Jeremy Corbyn to lead the New Left Party? I was quite surprised that 32%, only 32% say yes, we should campaign for it, and a majority, 32 said no, 42% said, sorry, I'm getting muddled up, my majority thinks we should not campaign for Jeremy Corbyn to lead a New Left Party. 42%, 32 think yes. However, should such a party be formed, would you join it? Yes, say 67%, and no, only 12%. That's quite interesting, Norman, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that is extremely interesting. I've got a feeling that a lot of the people who said that they don't think Jeremy Corbyn should start a New Left Party is they think the Labour Party as it stands should be given over to Jeremy to take over again. That's probably subconsciously or consciously is how they're thinking about it, because they were very happy with the 2017 version of the Labour Party, where Corbyn was addressing those huge meetings of people. And I think the reason they were very keen on that was because Jeremy was saying in one shape, form or another, those memorable words, it's not me they're afraid of, and they being the establishment, it's not me the establishment is afraid of, it's you, pointing to the crowd, because he was giving them the idea that they had real power in their hands, however misguided they were, but they thought they were coming near to power. And they thought in 2017, when they came close to winning an election, that they were coming close to having some kind of political revolution. I think this links right back to our conversation that we've had already, because I think the whole point about can you have a general strike and all that kind of stuff, I think what a lot of our speakers were saying was that what you need is political consciousness to do whatever you're doing. Matthew made a very interesting point that the strikes that are coming out now are joining up in the sense that there is an attack on everybody in terms of a cost of living crisis, and there is a unity of people in seeing what they can fight against. I mean, I come from South Wales, and I was there. I left not long before the miners' strike. There was a problem with the Great Miners' Strike in 1984, 1985. I left before the strike broke out, but I was going back to Wales all the time. And there was a problem in the sense that, and this is an historical one in South Wales, is that the miners had been so successful in getting good wages and conditions that there was a gap between them and the vast majority of the people in South Wales who were, large numbers were unemployed, large numbers were very low paid. My father was a bus driver. The difference between him and a miner in terms of wages and conditions was very wide. They still supported the miners, but it was difficult. It was difficult in the sense that they were supporting people who were much more well off than they were. And I think people forget that. And I think that was the same in other parts of the poorer parts of the country too. Whereas, will there be a Jeremy Corbyn-led party? I can see why people want it to be, but I think what's more important that we must do is we must look at the lessons of the Jeremy Corbyn period. I don't think there's been enough of that done. I hear a lot of people who are kind of like armchair prime minister, prime ministers or shadow prime ministers who say, well, Jeremy should have done this and Jeremy should have done that, and he made loads of mistakes. And surely he did. He made all sorts of mistakes. But I'm not sure whether the people who are telling him, oh, you should have done this and you should have done that and you should have sacked this person and got rid of all the horrible right-wing MPs, I'm not sure they would have done such a good job either. Because when you're actually in a power situation, when you're actually being advised by people, well, unless we do this, we're going to lose this election, or we're going to, terrible things are going to happen, that is actually a very, very difficult situation to be in. And I think what we badly need as a left-wing movement to do is to examine more closely what happened in that period. In particular, look at the problems of the parliamentary system, which is what Jeremy was up against more than anything else. He had all these MPs, right-wing MPs, and even ones who weren't so right-wing, but they were all very keen on the power that being in Westminster gave them. There were very few like him who wasn't that interested in the power that Westminster gave him. They were all interested in preserving the hierarchy, preserving the establishment. And he was up against that establishment. And however we got in, and however, if we have another Jeremy Corbyn or another left-wing party, they will be facing the same problems that we had before, which is the representative parliamentary system, where we give our power over to people who are absolutely not operating in our interests in any way whatsoever. They're operating in their own interests, in their own power interests. And there is a big problem to jump there, which I'm afraid won't be solved by having either a republic or having proportional representation. It will involve a much more fundamental attack on the sources of power. Why do we think that? Why do we think that's possible? Well, I think it's possible because we can see the way the establishment reacted to Corbyn. They reacted, they were terrified. They were absolutely terrified of anything like a Corbyn-led movement getting power. And that's why they banded together, the Labour Party right wing, the left, the Tories, the whole pack of them were never more united than in anything in wanting to destroy the movement that Corbyn had become the figurehead leader of. That's why we had Boris Johnson. They felt, and it's on the record now, they felt that only Boris would be able to smash Corbyn because Boris was a populist leader and they saw Corbyn as a populist leader as well. I think they were probably very wrong, but that was the psychology of that. So that's what we've got to do. We've got to examine why did the Corbyn party get destroyed? Why was it smashed? Why did it go from being in an incredibly challenging position in 2017 to being more or less wiped off the electoral map in 2019? Why did all that happen? I don't think we've yet examined that. And I think there is a huge need for education. On the trade unionism, as I'll just finish by saying this, I think absolutely on trade unionism, we need a program of education to inform people about what was going on. The film which started our film, the little film, was, I think, a wonderful starting point for that education, because what it does is it shows you that we've got to think much more about why trade unions are a threat to the establishment and how does the establishment react to them. That little film that we had at the beginning talks about that very sort of effectively, I think. And I think because for every trade union that goes off on strike and does lots of great things, there's large parts of the membership that aren't engaged. So apart from the people who aren't in the union, there's loads of members who aren't particularly engaged either, and they have to be educated. But I think that's a community-wide education. It's not a union. It's not a union-specific education. We've got to have a community-wide educational program. So we've got to try and understand the sources of our power. That's
okay.
it.
Let's stick to that second subject then that we wanted to discuss, which is the idea: could Jeremy Corbyn lead another party? Should he? Do we want to pressurize him? I mean, there is I think still a sort of feeling that had he become prime minister, he would have introduced socialism for us, and a lot of people saw that as some kind of I can do my cross there, and Jeremy Corbyn will do it for us. And I think that's a real danger, a sort of consumerist attitude to politics, that he will do it for us. We have to do it, isn't it? I mean, the Parliament question is a question of socialism cannot come through Parliament. I think we're all quite agreed, but it can act as a useful platform, and you can use Parliament to be the voice of the working class, but you can't introduce socialism like that. We have a few comrades with their hands up now on this. Shall I bring a few others in before you come in, Graham?
Yes.
I think so. Alan, please.
Right, I've just written this down. I believe we need a new socialist party more than ever now. Starmer has demonstrated that the majority of the Labour HQ, PLP, NEC, regions are not socialist. This has been recognised within the Ford report. It destroyed the Jews. It destroyed the CLPs. The membership has been lost. The Labour Party are not socialist whatsoever. Even if we did have, for argument's sake, Zara Sultana stood for Labour Party leadership, she'd be demolished. The whole right, they persecute her like they persecuted Jeremy Corbyn. There's no point in going to try and help fight for Labour. We've lost the fight. That's happened every time, as was said with the strikes, general strikes in 1926. The right are always know what's going on. They're always preparing. So let's not fight the right. Let's leave. Let's start our own new party for all of the left, with the help of the unions, and we can move forward. Otherwise, we're just going to be fighting ourselves all the time.
The unions have to want to do it, though, don't they?
Yeah, they do, and that's why we need to push them. But unions have the money. Unions have the money. Unions have the support. And unions need to do this, because we're not going to have unions much more. If the Tories get their way, they're going to block the unions. They're going to block people joining them. They're going to make it illegal to join a union, the way this government's going.
Okay, Matthew, you want to say something on this? Oh, sorry, Paul first.
Yeah, I think Norman made an interesting point with regard to the survey about possibly some of the people that don't want Jeremy Corbyn to create a new party and maybe hoping that he would become the Labour leader again. I thought that was I'm one of those, I would love that to happen personally. I'd like it if he would set up his own party. But of course, I don't think he will. I think he's too wedded to the idea of the Labour Party, even though he's a member, but hasn't got the whip back, of course. But the question is, will the same mistake be repeated as they were in the Labour Party? I'm not so sure, because if he did set up a new party, I think the makeup of that new party will be very different to the one that Tony Blair managed to cobble together from the early 90s onwards. So I do think the makeup of that will be very, very different. And I think the comment about republicanism was sort of dismissed. And I think that was wrong, because to deny the need for republicanism really denies the extent to which power really lies in this country, i.e. by which I mean the Crown. All legislations that come to the Commons, basically ministers, they're all ministers of the Crown, and they can decide what Parliament get to see, what they vote on, and so on. Trade deals are part of the royal prerogative. So no, it is actually a very important issue, and it does need dealing with. So yeah, I stop there.
Thank you, comrade. Thanks. There's a few people with their hands up, and we want to bring them all in. Felicity, you've got your hand up, but you're not got your video on. Do you want to just speak?
Yes, I'd like to just speak. Sorry. Yeah, I've been listening intently to everything that's been said, and I agree with a lot of things. The problem I have is that the majority of the population in this country don't necessarily even understand how you tie it all up. So, and also I'm a historian, and I see that every successful movement, and you can see even today, always has a leader or leaders. I'm not plumping necessarily for Jeremy. I'm just saying that we are rudderless if we don't have some leadership, political leadership. We're working within a system, and we need political representation, which we really don't have. And that's not a cry for proportional representation, but you just look at Latin America. They've even jailed the leaders there, and you'd see what's happened. Because if you have someone, and that's why Jeremy Corbyn was so successful, because he engendered that hope and that thought that yes, we can have a different society. And look at Latin America. Before they crushed them, you had a lot of leaders like this on the African continent. But so I really think that we could be just talking shop, talking amongst ourselves and understanding and agreeing, but not really aware of what's going on outside. And unless you have a focal point, I think it's going to be very difficult to make progress. We all wouldn't, well, not all of us, but a lot of us maybe wouldn't be here without the phenomenon of a leader such as Corbyn, for all his wrongs, and it was basically the system that got him. But anyway, yeah, that's really what I wanted to point out. Thanks.
Thank you. Matthew, I'm going to keep comrades now to 2.5 minutes, if that's okay, because we are running over time already. Hi.
Okay, all right, thanks, comrades. No, obviously, in very brief, I think the important thing here is to look at it and understand that the system of bourgeois democracy, along with, of course, obviously the economic system of capitalism, is in decay. It's actually falling apart. So this is why you actually get Corbyn is elected by accident, and actually is a part of that. At the same time, you're also looking at a situation where it was quite clear. I mean, it actually, what it did do for those people who could look at it, it exposed the ruling class itself. It was actually, forced to come out itself, nakedly against Corbyn. And it made it quite clear. I mean, you look at what's happening in the US. The US said, Mike Pompeo said, we will not accept Corbyn as Prime Minister. Quite clear. It's quite clear that the majority of the PLP, even if Corbyn had got elected in 2017, would not have allowed him to walk into number 10. No question. Absolutely no question whatsoever. And there's no question they'll allow him back in as a Labour Party candidate. None whatsoever. The problem is, of course, he doesn't have the politics. He doesn't want to stand against Labour Party, and he doesn't want to build another organisation. But the questions that he opens up are still in front of us. The question is, okay, what is the representation for the working class? And the conditions that we see in the previous discussion, where there's this mass attack, on the working class in general. What's the political representation? We see also the move by the ruling class itself towards authoritarianism. The fact that we now have a party in the US, the Republican Party, which is nakedly in favour of dictatorship, and which is using the court system, an undemocratic system, in order to impose ridiculous laws on the population which they don't want. And this is what's in front of us, and this, of course, will be used across other parts of the week. We're seeing move to the far right and so on. Not just here, but obviously throughout Europe and the US, and the move to authoritarianism and the possible move to fascism. And this is what we look at. And the question is, okay, how is the left going to organise itself, and on what politics? Thanks.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? There's about 40 organizations outside the Labour Party at the moment, all with very, very similar politics, and even they can't get it together. It doesn't look great. Steve, want to come in again? We have to keep it quite...
be quite quick, okay.
Yeah.
I have a little quote, little quote from Trotsky. So Trotsky says, "Program first, your political passports, please. No passport, no crossing the channel, just messing about in boats, rowing here, rowing there, and going round in circles." So number one, program. What is the program? Number two, which program have we got? Number three, what is the program? Number four, no program equals no party. So we really have to start, is the Corbyn program an adequate program for the current situation? And if it isn't the adequate program, restoring the 1945 social monarchy, is that the way towards socialism? I would say it definitely isn't. So if it's not that, then what is it? And I think until we address the program question, talking about parties is just going around in circles, up and down the channel and going nowhere. That's it.
Yep. Okay, Kevin hasn't spoken yet, so I'm going to ask him to come in now.
Yes, hello. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this issue. I don't think there's any chance of a new Corbyn party having any success, given the response of last week's talk with Williamson and how the Socialist Campaign Group didn't support him. So I think that we've got to look at the reality of life. We've spoken a lot about 100 years ago of the Russian Revolution, and we've spoken a lot about the trade union movement. That is a small minority of the working population, and we know that we've got to bring in other people who are not working. But the reality of it is that the trade union movement at the moment fails to recognize the attack on the citizenry by the New World Order capitalists. And we've failed to even think about or discuss whether we should campaign against COVID injections or whether we should campaign against compulsory ID, whether it's through QR codes or through vaccine passports.
I think that's slightly off topic now, Kevin.
No, the topic is about political education, and it's about the trade union movement being opposed to the capitalist agenda that's being foisted upon us. I recommend you to look at Peter Koenig in Geneva, for a full explanation as to why the trade union movement should take this important politically. It's not about bread and wages. It's about control by capitalists over the people, and the methodology of doing it will be through 5G and vaccine passports.
Okay, thanks. Don't think so somehow, but there you go. Mike wants to come in.
Thanks, Tina. I'll be brief. We're almost in, and this is the context of the conversation we're having, of course, and the context really of the work that Red Line is attempting to advance. We're almost in pre-Labour Representation Committee times here. There's a crisis of representation for working class people in politics. And I don't know if anyone's read about Starmer's big set piece speech in Liverpool today. Absolutely no sense that the system is in crisis, that we're in the middle of a climate emergency, that radical surgery at minimum is required. No sense at all. But in such circumstances, it's very easy to reach for straightforward and simplistic solutions and quick fixes. There's no such thing. We know this from bitter history of socialism from above. Jeremy and no one else is going to deliver that on our behalf. In Scotland, and I know there'll be a disagreement amongst the audience tonight, but far too many, for me, have folded their class politics into nationalist politics and constitutional politics precisely because it seems like a quick fix and it seems like something we can achieve. I think as long as we have first past the post, as long as the trade union movement is affiliated to the Labour Party, any departure on the left outside the party, no matter how much we would all want to see something fresh and energised and grassroots emerging, is going to have a very, very difficult time gaining any kind of traction. I think Norman nailed it earlier on, and really this is the question we're asking tonight and the Red Line is generally pursuing. We can't really, we're not in a position to demand or expect or hope for a Jeremy Corbyn or anyone else led party before we actually learn the lessons of what a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party, how they failed, why they failed, and what we can build on from those kind of lessons. Those lessons are really important, and I don't think we've quite, myself included, we've quite addressed those questions yet.
Yep, taking on the right is way up there as one of the lessons. Norman, you wanted to come in. Okay.
Yeah, just very, very quickly. I think the point of the Corbyn-led party, I think what people have to realise is that we've got unfinished business. So many people were unfairly expelled, suspended, put under investigation, blocked from standing for office under Labour over the period of time of Starmer's leadership, apart from what happened under Jeremy's time. We have got to address that issue. And one thing that I'm starting to try to raise as much enthusiasm for as possible for is for all the left-wing groups and individuals to come together to raise a huge protest on the Ford report, the subject of the Ford report. The Ford report, for whatever its faults, shows that we are totally vindicated in saying that anti-Semitism was weaponized, the horrible attitudes, racist, sexist attitudes of the ableist attitudes as well of the bureaucrats in the Labour Party was all there, and it does exist. We've got to use that report. We've got to go outside Labour Party headquarters in London. We've got to come together in as many of us possible and say Starmer must act on the Ford report. We know he won't, but we must use it as our calling point, as our gathering cry, and call on him to get out, or to put it into practice, or to get out of the Labour Party. We must show unity on that. We've got unfinished business. Too much injustice was done. Thanks, that's it.
Yep, and it's still ongoing, unfortunately, including on the left, where the witch hunt is still being implemented by some organisations on the left. So that's certainly unfinished business. Graham.
Corbyn-led Labour Party, I think at the moment it really is the wrong question. It reminds me a little bit of what Karl Marx said about religion. It's the sire of the oppressed. And I so sympathise with people who desperately want answers. But I think actually this discussion's been quite good tonight, because I think what it shows is we recognise there's a political vacuum, and in the first instance, that political vacuum has to be addressed by the trade union movement. Now, I don't agree with the comrade who says not bread and roses, but something else. Not bread and wages, sorry, but something else. It's actually, that's where our movement starts. Bread, wages. That's how all movements have started, through material struggles. But we've got to go beyond that. And I think Matthew actually made a really important point about the contradiction between the Corbyn years, where there was some kind of political debate, but not really a trade union movement that was present. And now we've got a trade union movement that is, thank goodness, re-emerging, but of course there's a political vacuum. And I think that's our starting point, filling the political vacuum, in the words of Mick Lynch, by the trade unions planting their flag in communities. Now, Red Line comes from briefing, and briefing comes from the LRC. And what was common to those was the recognition of the unity of the political and the industrial. And that's what we've got to try to reconnect with. So I don't think that's, I think it's a shimmer and an easy answer. I just want to finish with a story about Ken Livingstone when he stood for London Mayor as an independent against Labour. Now, I know it's a generation ago, different political conditions, but it weren't that great then, believe me. We were under Blair, a triumphant Blair. And I remember there was a Labour left NEC member who went up to him and said, I'm going to come out and politically endorse you. And he says, no, you won't. He said, I'll get in anyway without you. And I want you to remain in the Labour Party, fight with the comrades, so that when I can come back, there'll be a party worth joining. Now, it may be that we're past that point. I don't know. And I don't think anyone really knows. But that is a question for the whole movement to determine, not to skip stages, declare something because that's how we feel, from subjective reasons. Oh, I've been thrown out, therefore the Labour Party has changed its class character. Well, that's nonsense. I'm not saying anyone said that tonight, by the way, but that you get that kind of subjectivism, and we'll see. It's possible that actually Starmer may succeed in destroying the Labour Party, but not without the fight of our lives. So my attitude is, fight above all within the trade union movement, build that resistance, and find ultimately a political expression that has a programme that goes beyond the economic, beyond the bread and wages, but through the Labour Party if we may, and without it and outside it if we must build or rebuild a Labour Party fit for purpose. So that's the way I would look at it. And it doesn't lead to easy, simple answers, I'm sorry, because there aren't any. And I'd actually say that anyone who's got a simple answer in this difficult period is probably wrong.
That's certainly true. The class struggle moves about as well, isn't it? I mean, it's reflected in different arenas at different times and different forces. I mean, it was in the Labour Party. It's now moved to the trade union movement. I'm not quite sure I agree with you that it's our chief objective now is to go into the trade unions and fight through them. I think there's still, we also have to get our house in order. The active socialist left still also has to organize, and has to organize on a principled political basis, which I think much of them do not do. Part of this trying to get our house in order will take place in Liverpool during Labour Party conference this year, where a number of organizations and individuals locally and nationally have come together or coming together to put on a conference called Future of the Left, where we're discussing various issues. Red Line is involved, Labour Left Alliance is involved, other groups are involved, and I've put the link into the chat. I'll do it again. Look at it, comrades, come along if you can. You can also watch it online. But there are different arenas where we have to get our houses in order, learn some lessons, and talk how to move forward for sure. please become a Patreon supporter if you can of the show. Make a small donation, a regular donation. Maybe Mike could put the link up again, how you can support the show. That would be great. Even like a $5 a month can help us to pay the quite substantial costs for the Zoom account and our graphic designer, etc. Our next show will be interesting. We're going to take a look of what's going on with Momentum. If you are still a member of Momentum and you think that's a useful road to go down and there's useful things that can be still done with Momentum, we would like you to get in touch and perhaps come on the show if you're interested. We really do want to find out how, if people think that there is still something to be rescued. We also want to discuss what happened over the course of its foundation in 2016 to now. And can it be rescued? Can it become something useful for the working class still, or be resurrected as something useful? We have heard the reason we're doing this is because Naomi Wimborne-Adrissi has been not supported as a candidate for the NEC elections by Momentum, which we're taking as a jump-off point to look at what's been happening with Momentum the last few years in a bit more detail. So we hope you join us next week. That's August the 1st for that, and then we discuss it again with the audience the week after. Thank you, comrades, for joining us. Hope you're having a good evening. I thought it was a very useful discussion, wide-ranging as always. See you soon. Bye.